So, you've probably heard this idea before, right? That the best way for kids to learn is just by letting them follow their curiosity, let them play freely. Well, that idea, that's the heart of what's called child-centered education, or CCE. It's this huge philosophy that's totally reshaped classrooms all over the world, and it comes with this amazing promise to unlock a child's natural love of learning. But what if that beautiful ideal has a much more complicated, maybe even a problematic side to it? Okay, let's really get into it.
All right, so here's the game plan for this explainer. First up, we're going to nail down what child-centered education actually is. Then, we'll look at why it got so popular in the first place. After that, we're going to switch gears and dive into the serious wave of criticism it's faced. We'll even get into some really deep stuff like power and bias. And to wrap it all up, we'll see what modern research says about, finding that sweet spot, that perfect balance in the classroom.
Okay, first things first. What exactly are we talking about when we say child-centered education?
When you strip everything else away, this whole debate really comes down to this one huge question. And believe me, different educational philosophies have wildly different answers. CCE's answer, though, it was a total game changer.
See, instead of that old school model, the teacher stands at the front and just pours information into students' heads, CCE completely flips the script. It says, no, the child is an active participant here. They're like a little explorer, building their own map of the world. The whole focus shifts to their individual pace, their interests, and that natural curiosity they're born with.
And this really shows you the massive shift in roles. Think about it. In a traditional, teacher-centered classroom, the teacher is the sage on the stage. They're the star of the show. But in a child-centered room, the teacher becomes the guide on the side. They're not just lecturing. They're observing, asking great questions, and basically setting up this amazing environment full of possibilities, so the child can discover things for themselves, usually through something as simple as play.
Okay, so when you put it like that, you can totally see the appeal, right? Let's dig into why this approach became such a huge deal for so many parents and educators.
The promises are really compelling. For the kids, the goal isn't just about memorizing facts. It's about developing a real love for learning, period. Becoming more confident, more independent. For parents, it's about being part of the team. And for teachers, it's a chance to ditch the rigid lesson plans and get creative, designing experiences that actually respond to the kids in the room.
And look, this isn't just some abstract academic theory. It's the engine behind some of the most famous educational models out there. You've definitely heard of Montessori, right? With its whole focus on self-directed learning. Or maybe the Reggio Emilia approach, which is all about creativity and projects. If you know those, you already know child-centered ideas in action.
But this is where the story takes a pretty sharp turn, because for all its popularity, CCE has been facing some intense, heavy criticism for decades. Some people have gone so far as to call it an impossible dream.
And this isn't new. Way back in 1970, scholars like H. Entwistle were already flagging a big problem. The term child-centered. It sounds amazing, right? But it can mean so many different things to so many different people that it's in danger of becoming just a slogan. One that creates a lot of confusion, not just positive change.
A lot of the modern criticism gets wrapped up in academic work, like this 2019 paper by Rajendra Kumar Shah. And it's not just pointing out one or two little problems, it pulls together a whole laundry list of objections, giving us a super clear picture of the other side of the argument. So let's start with the first huge issue, the gap between the idea and what actually happens in a real classroom.
Yeah, this is a big one. There's this massive gap between the beautiful theory and the messy reality of actually doing it. The ideal classroom, it's incredibly hard to pull off. You basically need small classes, tons of expensive resources, and, get this, teachers who have the energy and patience of what some critics call a super teacher. That's a tall order.
And the practical worries definitely don't stop there. Critics raise some other really big red flags, like if you give a kid total freedom, does that actually help them learn discipline? And if you focus so much on one individual child's journey, are you forgetting about the needs of the whole group or even society? And this one's huge. Does this philosophy kind of push the teacher to the sidelines, ignoring all their expertise and their authority in the classroom?
Okay, so those are the practical problems, but now we have to go deeper, because there's a whole other layer of criticism. This one questions whether the CCE model is neutral at all, and asks, who was this really designed for?
And this is a really big idea. A lot of critics argue that CCE is built on a myth, the myth of the universal child. It basically assumes there's one standard way for a child to develop, and that standard is usually based on Western, white, middle-class kids. So by ignoring a child's actual background, their culture, their race, their social situation, the system can accidentally end up making existing inequalities even worse.
And then you've got the feminist critique, which is, wow, it's pretty stunning. It basically says that the ideal child at the heart of this whole philosophy, the active, exploring, independent one, is actually a model built on traits we typically think of as masculine.
This is where that cost comes in. The scholar Valerie Walker-Dean wrote this incredibly powerful line to make a very specific point. For that male child to be so free and independent, someone else has to be there to serve his needs. And in this model, that someone is the teacher, who is very often a woman. She becomes this passive helper, a nurturer, and her own hard work and intelligence get erased in service of the child's big discovery.
So it makes you wonder, is the freedom in this system even real? Some critics say no, it's mostly an illusion. The teacher isn't gone. They're constantly watching, observing, and kind of secretly guiding kids toward the outcomes they wanted all along. So it's not freedom from control. It's just a more hidden, more psychological kind of control.
Okay, wow. So we've got this beautiful ideal on one side and some really deep, serious critiques on the other. So where does that leave us? What do we do now? Well, let's look at some recent research to see if it points a way forward.
After everything we've just talked about, the answer to this seems kind of obvious, but it's still worth asking out loud. If that universal child is a myth, then a one-size-fits-all classroom is just not going to work. So what does? This is where the research gets super interesting and specific. A study that was cited by the National Institutes of Health looked at this very question, and what they found was fascinating. For 4-year-olds, yeah, more child-led time was generally great for getting them ready for school. But for 3-year-olds, the pattern was totally different. It was like a U-shape. Both too little and too much child-led time were not as good as a healthy, balanced blend of child-led and teacher-led stuff.
So the big takeaway here is pretty clear. There's no magic bullet. The best approach seems to be a flexible one. A smart mix that can be tweaked depending on the age, the developmental stage, and even where the kids are starting from, skill-wise.
And honestly, that changes the whole debate, doesn't it? It stops being this big ideological war of teacher-led versus child-led. Instead, it's about building a big toolbox of different strategies and being smart enough to know which tool to use for which kid at which time.
And that kind of leaves us with one last big question to think about. Maybe the whole point was never to find one single, perfect utopian classroom. Maybe the real hard work of education is something else. Maybe it's that constant, thoughtful, day-in, day-out search for the right balance for every single child.